Well, here we are again, students. This is History 151G, and I believe this is the 9th lecture. So we're making pretty good progress here. We're attracting a few interesting topics, and I think it's going to get more interesting as we progress. In any event, let's take a look at where we're at. Remember, we were talking about the Industrial Revolution. Very, very big issue. Remember, industrialization, which is actually what we're even involved in today. We are still in an industrial revolution, though the level of technology has increased dramatically. We are still making things better. We are still manipulating the economy to increase our quality of life. We're very good at it. Well, I talked last time about cheap iron, I should say, cheap iron for industry. It's relatively inexpensive as far as a material is concerned. You can do so many things with it, from bridges to decorative items to bedsteads to reinforced construction on buildings. There's all kinds of things you can do with cheap iron. Well, let's look at one of the aspects of this. Another aspect, of course, is machinery. We usually give credit for the first practical steam engine as having been invented, you can see, by Thomas Newcomen. Thomas Newcomen realized that there is a great deal of energy in steam. Now, I'm sure unfortunately, you've probably all experienced this in a relatively negative way. Remember when you were a little boy or girl and there was something boiling on the stove and being lacking in somewhat experience, at least this was my case, put my hand up over it. Hello. I learned very quickly, you don't do that. If you do it once, it's very unwise to even contemplate doing it again. I got my hand burned. So obviously, if there's something burning your hand, there's a lot of energy being expended. A question we can ask at this time frame, is there a way to harness steam, all that energy, to do work? Now, there was a problem, a big problem actually, as far as mining coal is concerned. We're talking in Britain. There, the water table is high. As you all know from looking at a map of Britain, it's an island. It is surrounded by sea. Almost anywhere in Britain is not that far away from the sea, and Britain has a tendency to be very low. There are a few hills in Wales, a few glorified hills in Scotland, but for the remainder of the area, you're actually quite low. Of course, there's rivers and it rains a lot. The water table is very high. When they start mining coal in Wales, the seams of coal actually go under the Irish Sea. You can imagine what kind of water problems you'd have, not only with water table and eventually going underneath the sea, with water coming down through the soil and into your mine. You've got to have a lot of coal in order to make your iron. But how on earth do you get the water out of the mines? Oh, this is challenging, very challenging actually. You actually get in, and sometimes we have largely a bucket brigade. Go down with the buckets and dump it out. Well, that's not going to work very well. They become more clever with the buckets. Some of the inventors get the buckets on a wheel. And as you turn the wheel, the buckets go into the water and they pull it out. If it's a long distance from the mouth of the mine to the water, this isn't going to work. It'll only work if you're down a little ways. So you try to pull the water out by means of a clever device, but it has severe limitations. Unless you can figure out a way of efficiently removing large amounts of water from these mines, they're going to become unusable. So Newcomen looks at steam as a mechanism by doing this. So if I can give you a representation of Newcomen's steam engine. Let's see if I can show you as cleverly as possible about the piston mechanism. What you actually have, does this help? You have heat down here that heats the water. Of course, the water goes into steam. Notice the piston. The steam forces the piston up. Obviously, steam has a lot of energy. It forces it up. You simply get up here, and how do you push it back down? It just literally takes a small sprit of water, like a little sprit of water that goes into the cylinder that condenses the steam into water droplets. In doing that, you create a vacuum, or something very similar to a vacuum, in the cylinder. When you have the vacuum in there, this pulls the piston down. So you push the piston up with steam, you pull it down with a sprit of water that condenses the steam, you pull it down. So you have a mechanism now by which you go up and down, up and down. Notice this is connected, goes over here to a, I'm not sure exactly what the terms are for this, over to the pump. The pump actually goes into the mine when it goes down, gets underneath the water. And when it goes up, the water that's on top of this is pulled up. Sometimes in one stroke, you can get a ton or more of water coming up. That's a lot of water. Boom, ton of water up. Boom, ton of water up by mechanical means. Rarely is this actually in the mine shaft itself. It's usually very close to the mine shaft. But if you reduce the amount of water in the water table near the mine shaft, you will also reduce the amount of water in the water table near the mine shaft. This is a very clever device. Can we say it's awfully efficient? No, we're not going to say that. But it is the first time we have a practical use of steam. The James Watt, we've got him down here. We say perfects the steam engine. Let's get James Watt up here. James Watt. Looks like an inventor. I don't know what inventors look like, but it's close enough. Okay. Let's go over and get James Watt steam engine. It's a little bit more complicated than his Newcomen's engine. It's more efficient, however, and it's more practical. It's also smaller. Smaller, more efficient. He does not invent the steam engine. James Watt perfects the steam engine. What can you do with the steam engine? Let's go back to earlier time frames. Water mills, excuse me, water mills have been around since the Middle Ages. The water mill and later the windmill are the first practical devices that people have invented to do work that does not involve either human or animal labor. As you know how water mills work. You have a wheel and the water pours over the wheel. It doesn't have to be a very large amount of water, but the weight of the water pushes the wheel. So the wheel turns. This is the mechanical nature of the device. And with the cam system, it turns a log, and the log rotates, taking the energy from the wheel inside the building. When it goes inside the building, a system of gears can take that energy and use it in a lot of different ways, depending on how you have the gears. If you have it near on a large stone, for example, you can use that to twist, and you can put grain in there, and it will twist and grind the grain into a very fine powder. We call this flour. It makes very good bread. You can have the energy go up and down. You have a sawmill. You have the energy go up and down. You have a hammer striking. You have a forge. You're only limited literally by your imagination how you can use this energy. But there are some real severe downsides to this. You have to be near an area full of water. Water has to flow. What if you have if you are up on top of a hill? It doesn't work. You don't have any flowing water. If you have a drought, this is going to be a big issue, unfortunately, in the French Revolution. When you do have a drought, so you can't grind grain. So you can't get flour, so people are even more hungry. We'll come to that later. But if you have a drought, you can't grind anything. Usually these things have to be quite large. So you can't place them in certain places, and they have limitations. In mentioning the windmill, which is also a medieval invention, that's even more problematic. If you have places like Holland, where the breeze comes off the North Sea very frequently, this is somewhat more reliable. Well, what happens when the wind changes directions? Well, you actually have a mechanism by which you allow the entire building to twist. But you have to have wind. It has to be largely consistent. It has to be largely from the same direction. So windmills have limitations too. What the steam engine does is actually take away these kinds of limitations. All you have to have is enough water. It's not a huge amount of water, not like a water mill. You just have to have enough water to put in your steam, put in your boilers. You have to have a fuel source. It can be wood. It can be coal. In certain areas, it can be peat, something that will burn. Do you have to have a lot of this? Well, you have to have some, but not a lot. Where can you put this? Anywhere you want to. Remember I said with a water mill, it's really hard to put this on top of a mountain because you don't have any water flowing. You can put a steam engine on top of the mountain. You can put a steam engine, goodness, you can put a steam engine on a bend of a river. You can put a steam engine downtown. You can put a steam engine actually anywhere you want it. This becomes enormously important. One of the more fascinating things I think about James Watt's invention, once he's invented these, and there are steam engines that are built many places. Now, there are improvements, usually in size, but they're largely functioning devices. If you maintain them, don't allow them to rust, repair worn parts. Some of these are around for many decades. In fact, some of them are around for like 100 years and are not actually allowed to deteriorate until we get a new technical advance, which largely comes into the world around the turn of the century, about 1900, which we call the internal combustion engine, which in some respects is more efficient than the steam engine because it's lighter. But the steam engine now allows us to do something we've never been able to do before. Very strong, very powerful, almost anywhere you want them. If you actually want to put them on a moving object, then you have an opportunity to have a moving power source. Robert Fulton is given credit with inventing, or shall we say, taking the first steam engine and placing it on a boat, which we would call it a steamboat. When you are moving goods and services on water, if you're on the ocean or sea, you have to deal with the wind. That is your power source that moves you. If you're on a river, it becomes more challenging because you have to follow the flow of the river. If you're going downstream, push yourself out in the middle of the stream, get yourself out in the middle of the stream, follow the current, takes you where you want to go. That can be very efficient. However, how do you come back? Let's pick on the Americans for a minute. Back in before the advent of steam, you had a major river system in North America. We call it the Mississippi. And it has the tributaries, the Ohio and Missouri and others. And you're very familiar with all of this. Let's say you're a young man by the name of Abraham Lincoln. and I believe it was twice in his career, young man, he's in the early 20s, he got on a, we call them flatboat. In other words, just take some logs and tie them together, and they had goods to take down to New Orleans where they can be sold and shipped to various places, not in the United States, various places in the world. So they push the raft out in the middle of in the flow, and they go down there. Not terribly difficult to do. But when you're down there, how do you get back? You walk back. You leave your vessel, excuse me, you leave your vessel there, but then you walk back because you can't bring it back. Fulton actually, I believe it was 1807, put one of these devices on the Hudson River. I believe he called the boat the Clermont. If you were on the Hudson River, Mississippi for that matter, and you're coming down from the Hudson River in upstate New York, bringing goods and services from upstate, and you bring your boat down, you're in the current, bring it up, goodness, you have to get over to the side of the river where it flows much more slowly, shall we say. But you're still got a amount of water against you. What you have to do is get over to the side and somehow push yourself up the side of the river. You can imagine the amount of manpower would be involved if you simply have men with poles. And the poles, they can push the poles against the side of the river if you're close enough. More often, because if you're the side of the river, you might run into sand or other obstacles. You're out a little bit in the stream, so you push these poles into the bottom of the river and you pull yourself up the river. How terribly inefficient is this? With a steam engine on a boat, we have a steamboat. Now you can use the river in both directions. You don't have to leave your boat at your destination. You can turn around and go back upstream. I've already made a big deal about the Rhine River, the most important single economic waterway literally in Europe and in the planet. And when you're going downstream, you don't have a problem. You're coming back up. Well, when you have a steam engine, now you can come back up. So commerce can go in both directions. You can make better use of rivers like the Rhine. Fulton actually went over to Paris, trying to find a bigger market for his invention. Napoleon, who was still in France at this time frame, saw a steamboat. It was on the Seine River. The Seine River is the main river that goes right through the center of Paris. Obviously, he was quite amused by this, Napoleon was. But the steam actually takes not only the rivers in the United States and Europe, but takes the world by storm. It has to be improved, but after a while, you are taking steamships across oceans, across the Atlantic. Some of the first steamships going across the Atlantic would use a combination of sails and steam. Sometimes if you ran out of fuel, like in mid-Atlantic, you better have the ability to put up a sail to keep on going. Sometimes the first steamships could not take you all the way across. Later on they can. Later on you don't have to have sails at all. Just go right up. And it's much, much faster. To go across the North Atlantic, it used to take weeks, sometimes even months, depending on the nature of the winds. With a steamship, you cut down weeks to days. Sometimes you can cross the Atlantic in like 6 days. You get on that thing, and of course the bigger vessels are a little bit faster. Sometimes they'll do it in less than 6 days, one way. I mean, talk about speed, talk about efficiency that we've never seen before. Within a matter of decades, all the major waterways of Europe, the Danube, the Rhine, the Seine, the Loire, the Thames, and others, have steamboats on them going up and down. In going back to the United States, at the same time you have steamboats going up and down the Mississippi, up and down the Hudson, and across the Great Lakes. So this is an idea that actually enhances transportation ever so much, so it can move goods and services ever so much more rapidly. Well, that'll move you across land. But how about taking the steam engine and placing it on rail, on a cart? and then you place it on a cart. Now you no longer have to move on water. See, water can hold a lot more heavier materials. You have to have a smaller steam engine. You have to be able to put it on a cart, which we now call a locomotive. And the locomotive now can pull goods and services across the land. Maybe I give a little bit too much credit to Stephenson. He's not the first person, not the only person, I said that wrong, not the only person actually to be working on the idea of a practical locomotive. We usually give him credit for coming out with the first one. The locomotive. The steam engine is still going to be heavy. When we get the internal combustion engine around 1900, a little bit before, a little bit after, now we have a power source that's much lighter. So even at a more efficient machine than anything that Newcomen invented, you have to have the ability to deal with the weight. It's going to be heavy. Just simply taking a cart with wheels and taking them across a country road, you're going to sink in the mud. You take it across a cobblestone, which are made of stones, a cobblestone road, it will smash the cobblestones. So these are placed on rails, which will accommodate a lot more weight. Rails have been used before this time frame. Remember I mentioned you going into the mines to mine coal, for example. You go into the mines and you can pull the ore out. Well, how are you going to do it? We can put it in a cart. Ore is heavy, it can break the cart down. If you drag it in a basket, it's just terribly inefficient. If you have rails, however, these are very small rail lines, of course, going into the mine, you can put your ore on top of in the cart and simply pull it out on the rails. So it's realized very early on to use a steam engine, you're going to have to put them on rails. When you put a locomotive, a steam engine, on top of a rails, now you've got a railroad. Stephenson's rocket. You want to have something that sounds like it's really powerful, really fast? Well, name it the rocket. One of your first practical locomotives. Stephenson was an Englishman. So can we say the first rail lines actually were developed in England? Notice that these things, let's get this up if I can, it's on a rail. The first rail line was something like 4 miles. It really didn't go anywhere. It was largely for demonstration. What Stephenson did in demonstration, he got his locomotive and placed it on these rails. There were carts behind them so people could sit on them. And even though the smokestack here is quite high, it still put out an awful lot of smoke and cinders, and it flies on back, and sometimes it lands on the carts behind. If the spark is active enough, you can actually have fires that are going to be started back here. Well, there's a cute story about when he first started demonstrating this. People came from all over. This is quite entertaining. And people want to ride on it. The fastest you could possibly go is on the back of a horse. Sometimes you can get this thing ripping something like 15 miles an hour. People aren't used to that kind of speed. They really don't see it. So anyway, you get on the carts, and you start chugging down the track, and of course the soot and the cinders come, smokes and belching out on the passengers in the back. The women's dresses get soiled, the men's shirts look dirty, and everybody's having the time of their lives. Oh my goodness, we have had so much fun. With the use of the railroad, there is a real possibility that now you can move goods and services much more rapidly over land, and not just by boat or by using carts that sink in the mud. This really takes Europe and later on other parts of the world by storm. Starting about 1830, The cities in England are spending lots of money. You got to get land, you got to get right-of-ways, you got to get depots. There's a lot of details that have to be worked out. But you try to take rail lines from town to town and city to city. They tend to make good money because people want to use them. So you can carry a lot more heavier materials on this than you can a cart. And it's much faster than walking or getting on a cart behind a horse. And one of the remarkable things about rail lines, you can actually take them not necessarily everywhere, but if you're willing to pay the price and cut the grade, almost everywhere. We're here I live in Oregon, you might live in Provo or someplace else. I can look up at the mountain, there's Mount Timpanogos. Wow. Could you put a rail line up there? You wouldn't think so, but you can. I have an example of that. There is a mountain range in Switzerland called the Alps. And it's a slightly different effect. You can sit right here. Where are we? About 4,800 feet. And we look up at Timpanogos, and that thing is about just a few feet less than 12,000, 11,900 and something. So can we say the difference between where we stand down here, where the mountain is up there, it's about 7,000 feet. In some of these places in Switzerland, it's absolutely remarkable. Switzerland does have a tendency to be lower. So you're standing here 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet above sea level, and you're looking up at mountains that are 12,000, 13,000 feet. And they tend to be quite vertical. The effect of that is stunning. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful. If you ever get to Switzerland, ever have the opportunity to go to Switzerland, do not miss it, because you're going to see some spectacular scenery. There is a rail line. Notice that this is quite steep. Part of the rail line going up to Jungfraujoch. The Jungfrau is a very tall mountain, over 13,000 feet. The Joch is right next to it, and I believe it's something like 11,000 feet. Part of this actually goes through the interior of the mountain. There's a tunnel involved. Can I show you the tunnel? Maybe I can, maybe I can't. You could imagine how expensive it would be. Very expensive to build a rail tunnel through a mountain. This is probably pretty solid stone. Not knowing anything about geology, I would argue that it might be granite, something that's very challenging to work with. And I'm sure it took many years of mining and blasting to do this. But in making that argument, see, Jungfraujoch is up here. The Eiger, Mönch, and Jungfraujoch is about right here. I apologize because you probably can't see the map very well, but part of this goes in the interior of the mountain. You don't want to have a rail line up the top of Timpanogos, but you could put one there. In other words, if you take the effort and expense and you have a certain gradient, in other words, like 7 degrees, you can put the rail line almost everywhere. And by fishing back and forth, you can go up sides of mountains. This becomes a stunning ability to move goods and services. In the case of the Jungfraujoch, you're taking up skiers and tourists. Since you pay a lot to go up there, they're obviously operating well, making some money. Well, starting about 1830, I said that wrong. Starting about 1830, railroads show up everywhere. When you go to Europe, and I urge you to go, if you ever get the chance, do not pass up on it. Talk about expanding your horizons. This is tremendous. I'd like to play a little bit of a game. Let's say you go to anywhere, go to a city, and look at the main train station. When they built the train stations, they built the train stations as close to the center of town as they could. In other words, you've got a city here, and the train station is going to be as close as you can right here. So around the middle of the century, 1840s, 1850s, when a lot of these were constructed, you can see the size of the city. Nowadays, the train station, main train station is often downtown, and the city's much larger. But you can take a look at this and see what the cities were like at that time frame. As a historian, I find that interesting. Since the rail was invented in England, in Britain, the people on the continent, France, Germany, and many other places, they want rail lines too. However, they want to make sure that they're getting the best possible engineers. So they hire English engineers, British engineers, to come down and build their rail system. Now, here's a difference. If you're up on a rail system in England, remember, England and Britain drive on the left side of the road. On the continent, you drive on the right side of the road. It's just one of these little quirks that's different. So the rail lines in Britain go on the left side. Logically, they should go on the right side on the continent, but really they do not. They go on the left side. Because when the British engineers came down here in these various places, they built the way they were used to it, on the left. Why am I telling this story? It almost got me killed. Back when I was in my 30s, I happened to be visiting Austria. Up in the mountains. Austria is beautiful. It's got a lot of nice Alps too. I highly recommend it as a place to visit. Well, I'm up there and I can hear a train coming off to the side. I guess I don't really know in which direction it's coming. I can see a train over this direction. So I'm talking to a guy and I decide, well, I'm going to turn my back to the train line. And I turn my back to the train line and I'm talking to this man. There was a gentleman who caught my eye off to the side. And he went like this. So I took a step forward. Whoosh! The train from the other side. I expected the train to be coming from that side. It was coming from this side. I honestly believe had I not taken that step forward, I would have been splattered all over the Alps. So I think the British engineers are out to get me. I also think that gentleman, and I really should have gave him a hug. I think that man saved my life by giving me a simple warning. Well, okay. I'm glad I'm still here. Very, very glad. Okay. Railroads after 1830, almost everywhere. Sometimes states, nations, I should say, with bigger distances do have a tendency to build more rail lines. You simply want to connect A and B. You simply have to have more miles. The United States is actually a good example of this. The United States got into the railroad building boom a little bit late. We're over here, not in Europe. The first steam engine in the United States like 1838 or something. And Martin Van Buren, president of the United States at that time frame, says, he's kind of old-fashioned, doesn't really want that. Well, everybody else does. In a couple of decades, it's absolutely remarkable. The United States has over 30,000 miles of rail line. In 1862, the United States decides they're going to build a rail line from Missouri to California, the Transcontinental Railroad. It is one of the most stunning engineering feats anywhere, not only in the United States, in the world in the 19th century. And it's completed in 1869. Next couple of decades, you have like 5 lines, not just the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, but 5 major lines going from the middle part of the United States to the coast. Another stunning example of rail construction is the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which is largely built after 1900. As you probably know, Russia covers like 11 time zones. And to try to control what's going on in St. Petersburg, the capital of that time frame, and way out in Vladivostok, which is on the other side of Siberia, it's very nice to have a rail network. So this becomes huge, but it becomes possible because of the rail lines. In real terms, what are we talking about as far as industrialization is concerned? The GNP, the gross national product, which is actually a measurement of economic power and activity that's going on a certain place at a certain time. In real terms, now remember, inflation can be a factor. Let's say your economy is growing at 2%, but inflation is at 4%. So you have to negate the inflation and look at real terms. Take inflation out of this and see exactly how everything's growing. The GNP, this is Britain, however, in real terms, in 20 years, doubles. Goodness, what's that per year? 3%, 4% a year? That is a stunning growth rate. Many countries of the world, right now as we speak, we're happy with like a 0.5% real growth rate. And to have this happening, you can see what industrialization is doing. Just back off the next half century, say 1801 to 1850. In real terms, we're up 350%. My, oh my. You see what's happening to the economy, what's happening to how people lead their lives on the basis of industrialization. If we wanted to take this farther, 1850, 1900, you could see it's still growing at quite a remarkable rate. I mentioned earlier when I was introducing the idea of the importance of industrialization is also how there's a shift in wealth. There's also a shift in power. Britain was rich before industrialization, but industrialization had become even more rich. Some areas that hadn't been doing very well, like Belgium. Belgium becomes industrialized, we say. Obviously, there's a process that keeps on going on. You might pick it up on a decade and say this is when we become industrialized because you have essential industries being developed that time frame. But industrialization continues on and on even after the time frame we're discussing. Can we say Belgium in the 1830s becomes industrialized for the first time? Why Belgium? Well, Belgium's close to England. They're old friends, actually. And they're able to get the basic industries and ideas from the British. Now, there are certain advantages in coming to the game a little late. One of the advantages is this. You don't have to invent the technology. Now Britain doesn't want it to get out. But if there's money involved, you'll find a way. You'll bribe officials. You'll smuggle things out. However it takes, you'll get the material out. So you do not have to spend the time of building up the industry. You can buy it or steal it. Something else is involved as the various governments almost everywhere realize the industrialization does their economy a lot of good, therefore their political power a lot of good, therefore their people a lot of good. You're going to get money from the government. The government's going to buy right-of-ways for you. The government will give you loans to build railroads. Sometimes these loans are not even being paid back. In other words, they're giving you money in basic industries to build industrialization. Can we say by the 1830s, Belgium leads out. Pretty soon we got France jumping on board. Belgium's too small to be a great nation. France isn't a powerful nation. It builds up their wealth, yes. Let's take a look at Germany. My goodness. Germany is one of the more backward countries in Europe. It's politically fractured until unification in 1871. I've already mentioned that there's a tendency to fight a lot of wars on German soil, which doesn't do their economy any good. You take this, shall we say, backward country, it's backward economically. By the 1870s, Germany is the most powerful nation in Europe on the basis of industrialization. Whoa, big change. The United States, little bit, two-bit country. Nobody's paying attention much. It's across the ocean. We're over here doing our thing, largely an agriculture nation. By 1860, if we were going to pick one decade to say the United States becomes industrialized, it'd be the 1850s. By 1860, the United States is really going, and it continues to grow. In 1800, the United States is a small nation, economically weak, population relatively small. Nobody pays attention to them. By 1900, the United States, because of population growth and because of industrialization, is the premier power in the world. And the United States still has that much authority even today. Other nations, Sweden, Russia, backward, yeah, but it becomes industrialized after the 1870s. Japan is a very backward nation. Doesn't even allow international trade until the 1850s. After 1870, Japan rapidly industrializes and becomes the premier power in Asia, at least the Far East. Well, so we're talking about political changes, change in power structure in the nations. Major changes in wealth and power, absolutely. Now, it seems like almost every major change does not actually help everybody equally. One of the problems here in change in wealth and power are social problems. Children have always worked in the economy. Out on a farm, even a small child sometimes can help you grow crops. Now remember I said we were talking about sowing grain? Before you have machinery, put it into the ground. Have a little boy or a little girl with a stick trying to keep the birds away before dad can rake the seed back into the soil. A small child can go out and gather eggs. It's not uncommon, it's expected. Children work. However, when you start building factories, initially people are saying, well, children work in the farm, why don't they work in the factories? It becomes more challenging because people realize that you can hire children and they can, actually they're easier to push around and easier to abuse than you can adults. And adults, you have to pay them more. We say the exploitation of children. We can say children work very hard on farms, there's no doubt about that. When you have children working in factories, however, now you see the problems with child labor very close up. You start seeing children that are doing dangerous jobs, jobs that are life-threatening, jobs that can cause them to lose fingers, they're on machinery, thumbs, hands, they breathe in materials, they die young. This becomes a scandal. Among the social problems, you can look around and say the industrialists are making big money. They live opulent lifestyles, they show off. The well-dressed lady changes her clothes in the morning wear. She changes her clothing in the afternoon wear. And she changes her clothing in the evening wear. You need 3 dresses to get through the day. Well, if you're rich, you can afford it. Show off, why not? While many people, shall we say on the lower level of the social economic scale, are having a hard time keeping themselves dressed once a day. And in your city, you can sit here living in poverty and go a few blocks away and see people living in opulence. That becomes a little bit hard for a lot of people to stomach, particularly when the jobs they do are boring, long, 12-hour days being common, being paid very little, sometimes not even enough to support themselves. There are times in industrialization where people working in factories can't even afford an apartment. What you'll do is go out and maybe sleep on a park bench. And they don't like you doing that. The police come and rap you on the feet and tell you to leave. So you rent not an apartment, you rent a bed. You rent a bed for a few hours. Hopefully it's 8 hours to get enough sleep. And sometimes this bed accommodates several people throughout the day. Sometimes they're called hot beds because when the guy was in it before you, his body heat still has warmed up the blankets and you hop in again. You see, and I'm not saying that there's not across the board improvement in people's condition, but I am going to say there are people in society that benefit more than others. So the social problems, it's going to take a long time to try to resolve these, including better working conditions, better hours, better pay. That's a little bit farther down the line than the time frame we're discussing. Let's look at something else that's happening at about the same time, politically in France. We make a big deal over the French Revolution. I think we should. Unfortunately for the scope of history, we do see some things happening here that are negative. This shows you what can happen when matters get out of hand. So it's a standing warning for that kind of thing. It's also a standing warning for the upper classes, the ruling classes. Then maybe you better start paying more attention to the lower classes, because now the lower classes are getting a voice. There are attempts in the French Revolution to take the basic ideas of the Enlightenment, reasonable, rational governments, responding more to the needs of the people, and taking them and trying to implement them with sometimes some success, unfortunately sometimes with little success. Well, let's take a look at the French Revolution. Let's take a look at the financial problem. Can we say that the problems with finances actually lead to the French Revolution? Because it's the problem with finances and taxation that leads people to be very upset, and it eventually leads to a changing government. Problem with finances. France is broke. Why is France broke? It's a big nation, agricultural nation, big agricultural nation, lot of resources. Why would a nation that wealthy be broke? Well, remember we talked a little bit about this back on Louis XIV. Elaborate expenditures. It's very, very expensive. The kind of clothing that Louis XIV wears, a number of wars are very expensive. Building this enormous palace, the Palace of Versailles. You don't have to build another Versailles because it's already been built. But the expense involved in just maintaining that court is really quite a burden for the French economy. So wars and lavish court. I did mention some of the major wars of the 18th century before the Napoleonic era. Remember the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, and the 7 Years' War. It's one I did not mention because there's not really much going on in Europe, though there is. That is the American Revolution. It starts in 1775, goes to 1783. The French are always rooting for the Americans. Do they like Americans? Of course they like Americans. We're nice people. On the other hand, if we are victorious, we are effective, this has a tendency to embarrass. France, one of France's chief rivals happened to be Great Britain. In strengthening the Americans, they have a tendency to be able to hurt the British. This helps them. In the latter years of the war, the French not only are sending lots of money, they actually send combat troops. Almost every victory wrought by the Americans in the Revolution were fought and won by Americans. However, the pivotal battle, the one where the British finally realized they can't win, was the Battle of Yorktown. And half the combat troops of Yorktown are French. And one of the reasons why they're able to bottle up the British Army at Yorktown is the French Navy is out in the Chesapeake Bay, making sure the British Navy can't come and rescue them. So the Navy and the Army is very helpful from France for the Americans to win their victory. Even when the French aren't involved, they're sending money, they're sending powder, they're sending weapons. Americans always, very rarely, have any uniforms, but what uniforms are available sometimes come from France. If we pin the national debt of France, it continually goes up. However, when it gets after the 7 Years' War, ends in 1763, you get to the American Revolution, 1775, 1783, the French national debt goes up even more. It accelerates. When the war is over, the French go home. Having helped the Americans embarrass the British, they go home and ask virtually nothing of us. Sometimes people like to put down the French. Well, okay, put down the French if you like. But France is the only nation that ever came through and helped us. France is the only nation that ever came through and sent combat troops to support our institutions and our cause. Well, the King of France is Louis XVI. He's badly in debt. Because of the problems with finances going back many generations, France's economic markets are somewhat backward. In other words, to them you have to have specie, you have to have coins for economic transactions. In other words, a silver coin. If you look at other nations like Britain, you look at other nations like Holland, you do find out that as percentage of their GNP, they're actually larger, more heavily in debt than is France. Well, wait a minute, why don't you have these economic crises hit Britain and France? Britain and the Netherlands. One of the reasons for this is they're using paper currency. If you pull out a dollar bill out of your wallet, for example, if you do that, actually what you're saying is the government supports you in having that worth its value. Intrinsically, it's just a piece of paper with very nice ink on it. There's intrinsic value in coins. But if you want to expand your economy, it's very helpful to have paper currency. Let's say you need to meet a bill in the Netherlands, or Britain for that matter. Government expenditures, you're fighting a war in America, whatever might be going on. All you have to do is go down to the printing office and say, print me some more bills. Now, this isn't wise unless the economy is growing at the same speed. The reason for that is you have a factor of inflation. Inflation will actually tell you, oh, by the way, you put the money out there, but it becomes worth less. I'm not saying this is the best of all ways to run your economy, but I am saying it does work. You can cover your bills. Louis XVI can't do this. And his resources get to the point where he no longer has enough income to pay for his liabilities. In other words, he can't even pay off the debt which he has incurred or the crown has incurred over a lengthy period of time. Well, what can he do? You can tax more. As I'll point out in just a few minutes, taxation is not, you've bled the nation quite well. It's going to be quite challenging to find a way of getting more money out of them. The upper class are going to try, however. What can you do? Well, you can declare bankruptcy. Let's go back and pick on Spain. Remember, Spain is the most wealthy power in the world in the 16th century, in the 1500s. Well, wars, they're always fighting the Dutch, like for 80 years. They're competing with the English. They have a lot, and they have a lavish court. All of these things, and when go into their expenditures. And when the gold and silver dry up from the Americas, they have all this debt and not enough ability to pay for it. I believe it was 3 times that the crown, in a number of several decades, the crown of Spain declared bankruptcy. Bankruptcy means this. I owe a certain amount of money. I declare bankruptcy, I can't pay. One of the problems with this, you can wipe out your debt. But next time when you need to borrow money, suddenly your credit rating is horrible. When your credit rating is that bad, you're going to have to pay more money to service that debt. In other words, your interest rates on any money you borrow is going to be quite high because you're considered a bad risk. Can Louis declare bankruptcy? Yeah, he can. He can also declare a partial bankruptcy. Rather than saying I can pay off 100% of my debts, I'll pay off 50%. This could be a very bad idea. It's not good for your economy, obviously. It's not good for your ability to borrow money in the future. But who's holding the debt? Some of the debt is held internationally, but some is held domestically. A lot of the debt that's held in France is held by rich people in France, nobles. And they're afraid. They're afraid in a very, very big way that they're going to lose one pile of cash if Louis takes this desperate measure. Let's go back and see why Louis doesn't have more money. There's something called privilege. Privilege goes way back to the Middle Ages. Privilege, we're talking about the upper classes, the nobility and clergy. No, privilege means no taxation, no direct taxation. Now, I cannot tell you that if a nobleman wants to have fish for dinner, and he sends his servants out to the market to buy fish, and the fish is taxed Therefore, in buying the fish, you're actually paying that tax. But I am going to say, as far as direct taxation is concerned, the amount of money that the church and the upper classes have is untouched. You can sit on a pile of cash, and the nation will not tax you. How can you justify this? Go way back to the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, one of the reasons why you have the noble class develop in the first place was for protection. You had the Vikings coming down, you had the Saracens, you got Magyars and Avars. You are being pressed in all different kinds of different directions. And the peasantry realized that they're going to have to get a warrior class, we call them knights, a warrior class to protect them. If the function of this warrior class is to protect you, you should, as peasants, pay them, largely in a few coins, but largely in terms of food, to protect you. Now, over the centuries, my goodness, the upper classes aren't protecting anybody from anybody. Sometimes these guys are such old wolves, they can hardly even chase little girls down corridors anymore, let alone get on out of the battlefield and protect you. You see, the fiction has been handed down. The clergy is supposed to pray for you. The clergy does hand out money as well, so it's not exactly a total drain. But on the other hand, the clergy prays for you, and therefore they shouldn't have to pay taxes. So the taxation burden is not on the church, it's not on nobility, but it's on the peasants, the lower classes. One study I read, I was so shocked by this that I had to check out the footnote. And I went from the source on French history and looked at their footnote and went to their study. And yeah, there's other studies. I'd like to know if this is completely accurate. Maybe it's not entirely, but can we say to a certain extent, it is actually this burdensome. Let's say you're a peasant and your income is 100 francs. In taxation to the state, you'll pay 53 of those to the government, 14 to the clergy. The clergy, of course, is the church. The tithe is usually 10%. But once you start giving tithes and other donations, a coin here, a coin there, it probably ends up being about 14. You live on land. You're free. You're not technically a serf. But you don't own the land you work. And because you don't own the land you work, you have to pay a rent fee to the man who does own it, in other words, the Lord. So you end up paying, 14 to the Lord. So what are we left with? Out of the 100 francs you started with, you have 18 or 19 left. And you're supposed to live on that? Becomes extremely challenging. Let's look at what's happening with the inflation rate in France. Can we say between 1771 and 1789, the wages in France go up about 12%. That's not a very much big wage increase. That is functional, shall we say, if the inflation rate is low, but the inflation rate is not that low. Wages up 12%, while prices at the same period of time go up 65%. You are being devastated by the taxation system. And now inflation is eating you up as well. So you have to pay more for goods and services on a less of an income. I don't think it's outrageous when historians say that France had almost become a nation of beggars, which I have over here, nation of beggars. By this I mean you're not making enough money. I mean, you're employed, you have a job, you work in the agriculture sector more often than not, and start hanging out on street corners, maybe holding hungry children, holding out your hand, holding out a cup, hoping that the wealthy, somebody who's coming by, will take pity on you. The other peasants can't help you. They're in the same social economic problems you're in, hoping that a wealthy person will come by and drop a coin into your cup or into your hand. You see, when you have large numbers of beggars, your economy is not functioning well. Now, the church is not callous, but operating expenses on the church, the vestments, the buildings, the upkeep, that's expensive. The church will hand out some money to people. But subtracting from their income all the other things they're trying to do with it, they don't have enough money to hand out to you to actually make a big difference. There is something in France called the corvée. My French is awful. Those of you who speak French, I'm sure you're cringing every time I pronounce a French term. Since I don't know how to pronounce it, I'll just call it corvée. Corvée is also forced labor for free. Let's see, the Crown looks at the roads. The roads need to be repaired. There's a bridge. That bridge is crumbling. We want to repair the road. Now, the Crown, obviously the state, could go out and pay people to do this, but why not just force people? You're working very long hours, and you're really not making it anyway. And then the state comes by and rounds up the young men, say, oh, by the way, for a certain number of days, sometimes weeks, we're going to take you out on the roads. You're going to fix the roads. And we're not going to pay you. You're going to fix the bridges, but you don't get any remuneration for having done so. See, it's hard to put a dollar value, I should say a franc value on this, a monetary value on this. But you can see how this is actually hurting the economy. Well, there are courts in France, various districts of France. We call these parlement. This is not parliament with an IA, which we see in Britain. That we've already talked in several different occasions about parliament. This is not the same thing, though the words do seem to be somewhat similar. It's parlement. These are courts. The courts, as you well know, we talked about this earlier, tend to be the mechanism by which we enforce laws. If the court enforces certain laws, that way they will actually be enforced. If they do not, then they're not enforced. The Parlement, of course, is run by nobles, the upper class people. Remember, these men are afraid that the crown might, in desperation, simply have to declare bankruptcy, and that can hurt them financially a great deal. So the Parlement de Paris, the Paris Parliament, they demand a meeting of the Estates General. Look at the Estates General. It hasn't met since 1614. The Estates General did have some similarities to the Parliament in England. And this is true of a lot of places. We have the Cortes in Spain. We have representative groups coming from the money people of the state to give the king advice on how to get more revenue. The reason why the Estates General had not met since 1614, they don't need it. The king has enough power in and of himself to pass his own law. So why mess with this? It had been around since the 14th century, and now it simply winks out. Why would the Parlement de Paris, why would they want to have a calling of the States General? We can take a look and see this ploy. Let's go down to the next page, which we're now on page 8. Okay. There's 3 estates in the Estates General. And these are, the first estate is the clergy. Why is it the first estate? Religion is extremely important. You want to be in good with your maker. Then there's the nobility. And then there's the peasantry. The peasantry is not always just peasants who are working the land. We largely say this to everybody else. This can include lawyers. This can include craftsmen. This can include people who work in various occupations, from brick masons to carpentry to shoemaking. But most of these are actually going to be peasants. But it's not just them. So the clergy, nobility, and everybody else. That's how they met originally, as late as 1614. Now, the clergy and the nobles are from the upper classes. let's go down here. And when they met, as late as 1614, you voted by estate. So you have the clergy, the nobility, the peasantry, everybody else. If you vote by estate, the clergy and nobles are both from the upper classes. You see, the clergy is not the pious parish priest. The clergy is bishops and archbishops, very important men who actually get in these positions because they have family connections, including nobility. So can you say the clergy will vote with the nobles? In all likelihood, they will. So the clergy and nobility against the peasantry. If you're going to make any decision that comes out of the Estates General, it will definitely favor the nobility, the upper classes. We say, therefore, the calling of the Estates General is a ploy to make sure that the nobles will not pay, but make sure the peasantry will. Well, propaganda. They're going to call the Estates General in 1789. It's going to meet at Versailles. The third estate is going to be chosen by vote. This doesn't, I'm not saying that, one man, one vote in all cases. And women, of course, are excluded. You have to be like 25 years of age or older. You have to have a certain amount of land. You can't be a vagrant. But can we say this? A large percentage of the people are actually going to be voting for the third estate. We happen to be right now in election year, which happens very frequently in the United States, as you know. And we have, shall we say, promises coming from politicians. This is how you get elected. I will do better. I will fix our problems. That's very nice. As modern Americans, we realize that sometimes these people have very good ploys in fixing things. When actually they become elected, they're not always successful in making progress in that direction. Can we say, in this respect, politically, the people are not as astute as we are? You start to get elected, you start feeding people propaganda. Propaganda is information that is actually to help you, not that it's actually true, but to have a certain outcome in your ideas. In other words, vote for me and I'll fix it. Vote for me and we'll go back there. There's all these social and economic issues that the peasantry is suffering badly from, including taxation. These people make promises they probably can't keep. But the level of expectation for the lower classes gives them hope. And that is a factor. Hope is a factor in what happens in the French Revolution. Now, the weather is a factor here as well because it gets people upset. The hard winter. There's a hard winter. There's a hard winter in 1788 and 1789. The population of Paris, for example, was about 600,000 this time frame. Unfortunately, a large percentage of these people, maybe as many as a quarter of them, really don't have a domicile. They don't really have any place to live. They're living on the street. I mean, you can get together in the bottom of the church. You can kind of huddle up underneath a stairwell to keep the rain off you. But the people in Paris will freeze to death. The winter is so cold. They'll actually freeze to death unless you can keep them warm. So in the great public squares in Paris, it's necessary for the city officials to keep fires, sometimes bonfires, fires around virtually all night long so people can huddle next to them and keep from freezing to death. Now you can imagine how restive those people would be, how unhappy they would be under those circumstances. The Seine freezes over, the Loire freezes over, the ports freeze over. You can't get goods and services up and down the rivers. You can't easily move across land because there's so much ice and snow, and you can't move goods and services in and out of the harbors. Because of this, there is a major problem. You can't easily move food in from other places. Before the Estates General meet, before we actually formally start the revolution, there are aspects of the revolution that are taking place as soon as the weather gets better. As soon as the snow comes off the field, the peasants start moving in against the nobles. What are their issues? The nobles they eat a lot of different foods, one of which is what we call squab, which is pigeons. Well, where do the pigeons get their food? You get their food, you can bring them corn or grain. Why do that if you can simply turn them loose? They'll fly out in the fields and they'll pick the grain off the wheat. And then, of course, having a homing instinct, the birds will fly back in the evening, you catch them later and eat them. Something else you can do is you can have rabbits. Rabbits are tasty. And you release the rabbits. Now the rabbits go out in the field. The rabbits eat the grain of the peasants. Of course, the peasants can't eat the rabbits because they don't own the rabbits because that's illegal. So later on, you get your servants out there to chase down the rabbits. You kill them with sticks, whatever, and then you have some very tasty food. You see, the nobles are using some of their influence to get food that actually hurts the peasants because it hurts their grain. Before the states generally meet, the peasants are breaking in to the bird preserve and the rabbit pens of the nobles. They're coming in, they're smashing these open. They're grabbing the peasants, they're grabbing the rabbits, they're grabbing the pigeons and eating them, taking home and eating them. See, under a normal circumstance, if you only have a few people grabbing it, well, you of course, the nobles will have somebody out there to watch these people. Keep somebody coming in and stealing a rabbit, for example. If you got too many, what are these guys going to do? They're going to stand to the side. If it gets worse than that, you can call on the local constable, local police, and they'll come in and clean things up. But what if the numbers are large? If it's large enough, you can call out some militia groups. But you see what's happening here. We can be controlled very easily by a few people. As I've mentioned, I happen to live in Orem. I don't know the population of Orem, something like 90,000. Years ago, I was talking to a police officer, an Orem police officer. I forget how many police officers he said we have in Orem, 30 or 40, something like that. I go, okay. Well, if I'm speeding or I'm running a stop sign, police officer pulls me over, he has a lot of authority, I will do what he says. But let's say there's thousands of me speeding or running stop signs, then what is a handful of people going to do? You see, if society gets angry enough, then the normal means of controlling them no longer function. And this is what's starting to happen in the spring of 1789. Great fear. This goes on. It actually even gets worse in the summer of 1789, when the peasants, not just stealing rabbits and pigeons, start to ransack the nobles' holdings much more effectively. At about the same time, not only is the police not functioning well, but the army is no longer loyal to the crown. Then nobles have a choice. Can we stay here and stick it out? And hopefully things will get better later on, which many of them do. Or I can run and go to the countries and stick it out there. So we call this the Great Fear. Well, the Estates General meets at Versailles, and immediately it's deadlocked. Though we have three estates, clergy, nobility, and everybody else, they meet in one room, and the number of people present, however, are larger numbers of people representing the third estate. It does get rancorous. Rather than being polite to each other, we end up with shouting matches. And the first and second estate demand that we vote like we did in 1614. We two estates vote. Well, the third estate won't have anything to do with that. And they demand that you vote by representative. In other words, person by person. And the third estate has a lot more delegates there. It gets so rancorous that in reality, the nobles and the clergy are starting to feel nervous. In some cases, they're not even feeling safe. Some of them start, so I say, quit going to meetings. They kind of sneak away. A few of the people, shall we say the more progressive-minded people in the nobility actually will cross over and start sitting with the third estate. When we get to the, maybe I have this a little bit topsy-turvy, as far as the chronology is concerned. They're meeting in some of the rooms in this enormous palace of Versailles. And then one day they're going to continue the discussion. And the delegates come. Remember, most from the Third Estate. The delegates come and they find literally on the door, closed for repairs. As idiotic as this seems to be, apparently Louis XVI actually decided he needed to do some work in there. But he didn't explain what he was trying to do very easily. In reality, the Third Estate comes there and says, we're being dismissed. They've actually taken us, and the king is trying to do away with us. So they literally go to a room nearby, called a tennis court. Tennis, the modern game of tennis was really developed in the 19th century. Yeah, it used the term back in the 18th century. It's a little bit more like squash, where you're in a room, you whack the ball off, and the nets aren't even straight across, they kind of loop down. Any event, they go into the tennis court. This is June 20th, 1789. And they state the tennis court oath, where they say that they will not disband under any circumstances. And they will stay there until they write a constitution for the state of France. And they call themselves the National Assembly. And now they're not even considering the First and Second Estate. The National Assembly, later called the Legislative Assembly, meets from 1789 to 91. Let's go back to their oath in saying that this is going to write a constitution. As Americans, we remember what a constitution is, at least in our sense. It is a document written in 1787, which largely assures us a form of government. A constitution at this time frame also assures a form of government, but the implications are broader than this. They will write a constitution to limit the king's authority. In other words, now you're going to have a national assembly. That is going, the king still exists, but you're going to have a national assembly with real authority in the state. Can we say this is illegal? It certainly is that. There's no mandate from this at all. It's illegal. It's revolutionary. Well, these are just a bunch of, most of these are lawyers, however. The Third Estate represents lower class people, including the peasants. There's not one peasant there. Most of these people are lawyers who understand the law. Well, what can Louis do? He could be very high-handed, could he not? And go in and dismiss these guys. You're revolutionary, you're illegal, let's get rid of you. Well, the political and repercussion here can be quite enormous. Doesn't really want to do that. The men who are meeting in the National Assembly are getting very nervous because troops start to appear outside of the palace. You can see them out there. The guys, the big blue uniforms, marching around. And these men have no means of protecting themselves. At any given time, Louis could simply call in the army, come in and dismiss them. Why is the army there? Could we say for a level of intimidation? Yeah. I'm not doing anything, but I could. It's like having a gun nearby. Well, it's just a gun. I mean, it might be pointing in your direction, but don't be bothered by it. Of course you're going to be bothered by this. Then another major step happens in the revolution. Remember the rank and file, not the officers, but the rank and file, the privates, the sergeants in the army are from lower classes. And they are aware of their relatives, friends, out grabbing rabbits and pigeons. And they like what's happening with the idea of the National Assembly now writing a constitution. Discipline starts to become a problem. When the men are ordered to move in certain directions, they don't do it very well. Now, usually in a military situation, if you find somebody who doesn't get along or go along, what you find with these guys is you'll actually punish them. Punishments in armies this time frame can be severe. You whip these guys, sometimes severely. But if enough guys are insubordinate at the same time, then how do you get enough people to come down on other people? And then actually some of the men in the military units start to believe. They take their weapons with them. And many of them, it's what, about 15 miles away? It's a day's walk or whatever. It's a pretty good hike from Versailles to Paris. And then a lot of these guys start showing up in Paris saying, I'm here to support you, and I have a weapon. The army is now becoming disloyal. What would have happened had Louis actually taken the army and used it against these people? No one knows, but Louis has real reason to believe that they might not follow your directions. Because the army becomes less loyal. They become less of an ability to intimidate the people. I have my nice little statement here. If you lose the army, you lost the state. And that's quite true. Now you lost the means of coercion. Let's go to the mob in Paris. Remember, we had a lot of people that were hungry and cold in the wintertime. And they're afraid that the army, let's go back, the mob is actually taking control of Paris. And they're afraid that the army, shot at Versailles, would come marching in, get the cannon, get the muskets, start shooting them down. They want the ability, the means to defend themselves. Well, they got a few guys there in uniform. They're not enough to make much of a difference. What they need is weapons. What they need is gunpowder. Where can you get it in Paris? The Bastille, this famous prison, been around since the Middle Ages in downtown Paris. It's used as a symbol of royal authority. People in Paris look at that and say, this means of coercion, royal authorities here, you're a bad boy, and you end up in the Bastille. There's only like 11 prisoners there at that time. It's a symbol of royal authority. And there's a garrison there that has weapons and has gunpowder. So the mob comes in, and they start pounding on the doors. Of course, it's a large medieval fortress. Can I give you a representation of the Bastille? It no longer exists. That one time back in the 80s, when I was in Paris, I got on a bus tour. Okay, we got a singing group name. Okay, the Bastille no longer exists. You can go to the place where it stood, and they have a marker for it. It was here. There we go, a little bit of action, right? Medieval fortress, large walls. And the mob comes here, get a big one. The mob comes here and they literally demand of the garrison there to surrender. It's ugly. The man initially says, well, I can't surrender, and the mob threatens to storm it. And his name is Delaunay, and he makes a bad mistake. He orders his men to fire into the mob. It kills a number of people, but clearly it's not enough to intimidate the mob to be dispersed. It just makes them more angry. And they come in with battering rams, they batter down the doors and smash in there. And they take Delaunay and they cut him to pieces. They put his head on a long pole next to the mayor's head, because the mayor was a little bit close, shall we say slow, in giving support to the mob. What is the French national holiday? July 14th. The one time I was in Paris back in the 80s, I was not there during Bastille Day. I talked to a French woman years later and asked her about that. And said, well, what's it like? She says, everybody's drunk. All right, if you want to see a lot of drunk Frenchmen, I'm sure they have other celebrations in France and Paris at that time on the July 14th. But can we say symbolically this is very, very important? Well, the mob in Paris, you have to have some kind of leadership. There's a man who's not lesser nobility. Quite frankly, he's greater nobility. His name is the Marquis de Lafayette. You remember from your American history, the Marquis de Lafayette was a volunteer. He left France when he was a teenager. He was still 19, he was only 19 years old. His wife was like 8 months pregnant. But he heard about the American Revolution. He's so enthusiastic about that. He has to come over. So he comes over. He lands in America, loves everything about it. Works his way up to Washington's army. And he walks up to Washington, doesn't hardly speak any English at all. Comes up to Washington and says, allow me to help. Washington had a good eye for men of ability. And he actually gave this, well, he's soon to turn 20. But he actually gave this very young man more authority than you probably should have done so. However, his trust in the Marquis de Lafayette was not misplaced, because the Marquis de Lafayette was a very, very clever man and a very good military leader. At the Battle of Brandywine, he's even shot in the leg, defending America. He even shed his blood to defend the United States. He has one of the greatest teachers about the freedom of men, how to lead an army. It's largely composed of people who might not even want to be there. He has George Washington, one of the greatest examples of Republican ideals in history. The Marquis de Lafayette soaks this up. When he goes back to France, and he goes back and forth numerous times, when he goes back to France, he brings these ideas with him. People know his reputation. He fought in the American Revolution. The American Revolution was an effort not unlike their own. So they think he can be trusted. The difficulty with this is that these people are a little bit, shall we say, too much liberal, too much Republican, too much representation. Lafayette does complain in this direction. I don't give orders, I give suggestions. And in giving suggestions, maybe these people will follow it and maybe they will not. We can call this a military force. Can we say it's not very disciplined? So he leads the forces of Paris. Shortly afterwards, literally weeks later, the National Assembly comes forward with one of the great statements of rights. This is the declarations of the rights of man and citizen. Yeah, a few years later, they're going to have declarations of the rights of women as well. But they're saying man and citizen. This reads a little bit like John Locke's Second Treatise on Government. It also reads a little bit like Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence. At this time frame, Thomas Jefferson, who loved the French, he's a Francophile, loves the French, speaks French very, very well. He's the U.S. ambassador to Paris. Of course, Lafayette knows Jefferson. It is believed that when the National Assembly was running out early drafts of this, that the Marquis de Lafayette actually took this over to Jefferson and asked him to comment on it. I'm not sure we can say Jefferson had a big influence on it, but we do look at this and say it does sound a little bit like the American flavor, which we read in the Declaration of Independence. All citizens, all people, are free and equal before the law. The basic rights of man are liberty, ability to act, property. We talked about property rights earlier on. You have the fruits of your own labors. Safety and resistance to aggression. Safety and resistance to aggression obviously means that you should have basic rights to resist the government if it's oppressing you. It can be external aggression. It can also be internal aggression. Law is from the general will. Also sounds like Locke and Jefferson. From the general will. You do have freedom of religion. That's something that Jefferson does not talk about in the Declaration of Independence. And John Locke doesn't talk about this either. So we've expanded this to include an Enlightenment idea. Freedom of expression. That ends up in the Bill of Rights in the First Amendment in the United States, 1791. This is a couple years earlier than this. Before the United States had actually put this into our Constitution as the First Amendment Bill of Rights, the French are already arguing in that direction. The Enlightenment does talk about this as well. Freedom of expression is absolutely essential to have people understand what's happening, to hold their governments responsible, and you should be able to criticize your government. Rather than saying this is just an anomaly that took place during the French Revolution, even in France today, well over 200 years later, these are the basic rights of the French citizen. And it is the function even of the French government, even today as we speak, to assure that these rights are available to all the French. In October 1789, the mob in Paris decides to go out and arrest the royal family. The royal family has been literally holding themselves kind of off in the corner. When Louis realizes the army might not support him, he's not really willing to risk using the army. He didn't want to anyway. He doesn't like killing people. But as long as the king is, shall we say, independent, can he say or do something to thwart what's happening, either in the National Assembly or by the mob in Paris? In October 1789, there's a mob. We usually say it's led by women. They march. It takes virtually all day to march out from Paris to Versailles. And they go in and try to, well, I want to say arrest the royal family. In reality, they say they're going to kill the queen. Her name is Marie Antoinette. She was viciously hated. She never did say when the peasants were revolting because they don't have food, well, if they don't have bread, let them eat cake. She never said that. There was a nobleman who said, well, if they don't have bread, let them eat straw like my horse. So there was callous people saying things. However, because she was so viciously hated, a lot of people believed that she was capable of this kind of thing. Well, the affair is ugly. Marquis de Lafayette is coming along with these people, not necessarily as a leader, but I don't even know, you can call him advisor if you want to. Ostensibly he's supposed to be a leader, but he's not really leading anything. At personal risk, he actually puts himself in front of the royal family saying, look, let's not do this. We don't have to destroy these people with the mob. Later on, the mob is going to go to Versailles again, and the guard at Versailles are the Swiss Guard. As the national color of France, as I'm sure you know, is blue. They tend to wear blue uniforms. The national color of Switzerland, the Swiss national flag, is a red flag. So when they are in the military, as foreign mercenaries in this case, they tend to wear red. Later on, when the mob came out to Paris again, they literally cut the Swiss mercenaries to ribbons. And they took their uniforms, which were red. Of course, there's a little blood on them by this time as well. And put them on their sticks, waving them in celebration as they marched back to Paris. From that day, even to the present, the symbol of red is often used as a symbol of revolution, of communism, of socialism, of the peasants using their rights. Okay. Well, they watch the royal family. They're under fairly close arrest, though they did try to escape in 1791. They were grabbed and brought back. Well, we usually say the constructive phase of the revolution is 1789 to 1791. What do you do in constructive phase? You do write a constitution. It's somewhat a little bit like what we see in Britain at this time frame. You do have a king. The king does have power. The king is involved in international relations. But power to make law is actually in the parliament. Very similar in this case in France. The National Assembly, now called the Legislative Assembly, are saying that you can keep the monarch, but we retain an awful lot of power. The freedom and rights, which I've already mentioned, the metric system. The metric system is an idea to make everything more reasonable and rational. You see, weights and measures are used in various ways. Sometimes even within nation to nation, the weights and measures are somewhat different. You can imagine the challenges that would be involved in moving from goods and services from one place to another, because the weights can be different, the measurements can be different. In trying to make everything completely rational, let's make a rational system that's very easy to learn and very easy to manipulate. Oh, they love the 10. They love the placeholder. You're very familiar with the metric system, though the United States is not on it. We're virtually the only major country that is not. In any event, the metric system is supposed to be based on a certain measurement. The measurement was supposed to be the distance, I believe, from the equator to the pole, to the North Pole. Well, the measurement was botched, so it's not exact, it's kind of an approximation. In Paris, there is I believe it's made of platinum. There is a platinum bar with 2 scratches in it, which is the meter. Of course, nowadays you don't have to scratch bars because you have electronic means of doing this. You can use wavelengths of certain kinds of radio waves in measuring this ever so precisely. The advantages are really quite huge. If you have a meter, which is the basic form, you have the basic distance as being a kilometer or 1,000 meters, which is about 6.61 of a mile. You want to go in the other direction, a centimeter is 1/10 of that. A centimeter is 1/100th of that. A millimeter is 1,000th of that. So it's very easy to manipulate this. And as you know, it's the same thing in using weights. You go from gram to kilogram, which is 1,000 grams, and a kilogram is about 2.2 pounds. This is accepted largely in France. And as France, during the age of Napoleon, goes out in various areas, including Germany and Italy, they bring this idea of weights and measurements with them. And when they bring them in and start to tell you to operate with these, the other countries actually like this and they stay with it. Britain was not conquered by Napoleon, was not invaded by Napoleon, so they stayed with the English system, which you and I are familiar with for a very lengthy period of time. It's probably within, I don't know, the last few decades that they've actually gone metric. I was talking to an English woman, a young woman, probably 20, 22 years of age, not that long ago, and asked her, well, when did Britain go metric? She says, well, it's always been metric. In other words, it's always been metric as far as she can remember. The United States did follow to a certain extent because the United States dumped the system, the cumbersome system of coinage, which we inherited from the British, to a system that's perfectly graduated. The penny, the dollar, the $10 bill. We don't have half a crown or shillings and pence. We don't have these kind of things. Our coinage system is actually very good. Should we have gone metric? Maybe, but no one really wanted to back that early. So the United States government didn't go in that direction. Now, can we call this a constructive phase? A lot of the important things have happened. The Constitution, weights and measures, freedoms, and then the Legislative Assembly decides to step down. Remember, going back to the example of the Long Parliament over in England, you do not want to have this situation where you simply have a dictatorship of these people. You want to step down so the Legislative Assembly will continue to have the representation and therefore the goodwill of the people. The big mistake is this: it's not standing down. The big mistake is saying that the members of the Assembly that had already served cannot be reelected or may not be reelected. So you've taken these people, they've shown themselves able, they've actually created this system, and now they cannot continue to serve. So if people coming in, everybody has less experience because everybody coming in virtually has no experience. Can we say at this point, the French Revolution takes a very vicious turn. Why would these people say that they cannot be reelected? Well, if you took everybody who had been serving, they're all reelected, all back in, then obviously you can create a dictatorship of the assembly. They wanted to prevent that, but they probably shouldn't have worried about that, because there have been enough people that were elected who had not served before that the people would actually view them as giving them proper representation. So now we come to the brutal phase. We tend to call the brutal phase led by the Jacobins. The Jacobins were a political group. Can we say they're largely radicals? The Legislative Assembly has about 700 members at this time frame. With 700 members, and I'm not going to say that the Jacobins are controlling everything, or shall I say numerically they're controlling everything, but there's enough of them who come in with some pretty hot ideas that they are calling the shots. The radicals are dangerous because they make policies that are dangerous. In April 1792, the Legislative Assembly, the Assembly declares war on Austria. The idea was this: the people on our borders are technically hostile to us. At least the nobles are. Do they want to see us fail? Yeah, of course they would. You see, if this is successful in France, people in other countries are saying, well, I don't want this kind of thing to be happening in my country either. There is no war. Will there be a war eventually? Oh, probably. I would say very likely. But the longer you have peace, the better off you are in taking care of your situation and making sure your reforms continue. Well, why would you declare war on Austria? Well, how about this? You declare war on Austria and your armies are successful. Oh, is that something you can take to the bank? Absolutely not. But if your armies are successful and you come marching in to various areas and you're bringing with these people the ideology, freedom, equality, look what we have as Frenchmen, come and join us. Austria owns lands in Germany on the border with France. Initially, when the French are somewhat successful, they are technically successful. Not that their army's that good at this point, but there's a lot of them. And quite frankly, the Austrians are caught flat-footed. Usually there is an era of tension to build up your military before you go to war. And shall we say the era of tension had not been that strong. In any event, the French actually grabbed some lands of German-speaking peoples. Well, the Germans don't really like the French very much. And then the French aren't being well supplied, so they plunder. They go into these German-speaking areas, and they grab your chickens and they grab your pigs. And then they say, join us for our freedoms. And these people don't like them. So this is a failure. When war breaks out in 1792, we're going to see virtually continuous war in Europe for every year until April 1815, when Napoleon is finally defeated at Waterloo. What's that? 22 years of war? War does not help you. War can destabilize you. And the assembly doesn't really realize this. Well, they're involved in some things. I think this is kind of interesting. The calendar reform, the old Christian calendar. It's not the year 1792. It's the year 1. What's wrong with the Christian calendar? Well, it's Christian. We don't like religion, do we? Let's do rational things. So we start in year 1. Remember, our calendar, the Christian calendar, does not start in the year 0. It starts in year 1. So they don't start in the year 0. They start in year 1. 1792. We want things more rational. We have 12 months. It's kind of hard to tell the moon not to circle in 28 days. They have 12 months. They shift from the 7-day week, which they think is religious, from the 7-day week to the 10-day week. We have a 24-hour day. Let's take it to the 10-hour day. I guess I'm kind of poor in telling time anyway. I honestly think this is something of a challenge. why on earth is this any better? But it's 10, right? 10-hour day. I believe it's like they actually broke it down by tens into minutes as well. In a museum in Vienna a long, long time ago, I saw a small clock, and it had the 10-hour day, 10-hour clock, and in the corner it had the 24-hour, the 12-hour sequence that you're familiar with in telling time. I guess this was a learner clock. You look at the 10-hour day and you go, okay, what's the 10 hours here? Look over in the corner. And you can see what time it really is, so you can relate, and after a while you don't have to look at the smaller clock at all. These things don't stick over time. Remember, if you have 12 months made of actually 30 days each, there's going to be, what, 5 days left over at the end of the year, and those end up being holidays. What I don't know is was it like the 10-day week was like the 7-day week, where you get Sunday off, 1 out of 7. I don't know if you got, I think you only got 1 out of 10 days off, which I think is quite challenging. Getting up and going to work Monday morning, having 5 days until the weekend is challenging enough. But you get up and have more days, ooh, becomes a problem. The war does not go well for the French. Yeah, initially, we actually have invasions that go into German territory. But then there's retaliation. The Austrians and their allies, German states, get together and their armies start invading France. And now you get a big problem. How on earth are you going to control what's going on? Because there's so much hatred involved, people start looking at Louis as being a traitor to the state. Now, he's the king. He does try to escape in June of 1791. They capture him and bring him back. Obviously, he's not supporting what they're doing because he's trying to get away. Is he supporting people from outside? Well, actually, he's not, except that he does send letters hoping people will come to his aid. And when these letters are intercepted, people are going, the king's a rat. They try him for treason against the state. Remember, he's tried in the assembly, 700 people. Of course, the debate goes back and forth. They finally decide he's guilty. They finally decide that he is treasonous. How shall we punish him? So there's votes on this. We can incarcerate him indefinitely, lock him up, send him away, exile him, something like that. But in a very close vote, a very, very close vote, they actually vote to kill him. He's killed by guillotine. In January, guillotine is this blade, it's on a weight, comes down and cuts your head off. He's executed in January 1793. Can we say the assembly's already been involved in brutality, declaring war on the enemy? But now we're really going into a brutal phase. And sometimes when we take the next step and start talking about Maximilien Robespierre and the kinds of things that he is doing, now we get into the terror or the reign of terror, which we will have to discuss next time. In the meantime, have a great day. We will be discussing that later. And I enjoy whatever you're doing. And I'll talk to you next time.